This one has the song from above. Bring me confidence, bring me sunshine. It's make me love. You can write to Frank Skinner at P.O. Box number 20134, London W10 6FS.
Pat's had a bit of a shock then. A bit?
If my bloke had gone and got that on the black market without telling me first.
Oh, you'd have had the time of your life.
Right.
Listen, you've got to live for today.
Typical that is. Pat might be happy with the relationship, but all you know.
You're all the same, you fellas, aren't you?
Oh, what a lovely couple.
The last thing she wants is a load of passion. But what happened to her last two marriages?
You can't sympathise with Roy, but with a new drug like that, anything could have happened. He should have seen the doctor first.
Yeah, too right. It's easy to judge, but you don't know the half of it.
You sex affair.
Eastenders, everyone's talking about it. You're watching BBC One. Now, Vote 99 with Kirsty Wark.
Good evening and welcome to Vote 99. Today has been dubbed Super Thursday, with local and national elections across Britain, the biggest test of Tony Blair's government since the general election. It's been an historic day here in Scotland as people voted for the men and women who make up the first Scottish Parliament to sit since the last one was dissolved on the 28th of April 1707. In Wales too, voters have been choosing the members of the new National Assembly for Wales. Both these elections will have a profound impact beyond the borders of Scotland and Wales as Britain comes to terms with the new constitutional arrangements. And in England, Wales and Scotland, we're electing our local councils. We'll be there as England's councils declare tonight, providing not only a mid-term verdict on Tony Blair, but also of William Hague's leadership. But first, news of the BBC's election night poll. In Scotland, it predicts Labour will be the largest party, but they will not get an overall majority in this election. This means Scotland could well be heading for coalition government. In Wales, it's on a knife edge whether or not Labour will get an overall majority. It suggests Plaid Cymru will make strong gains. Well, in a moment, Peter Snow will explain the details of all that for us. But first, these are the scenes at Meadowbank in Edinburgh, one of the many counting halls across Scotland. They're counting 6 constituencies here, using 1,300 people, almost twice the number at the general election. It's going to be a long night. We're hoping to get the first declaration sometime around midnight and the last perhaps as late as 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. This is the first time that this electoral system, a form of PR, has been used in Britain. In the elections in Wales and Scotland, you cast 2 votes, one for your constituency MP and the other for a party or an individual on a list. In Wales, the boxes containing the assembly votes won't be counted until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Very civilised, but agony for the candidates. Glyn Mathias is in Cardiff, where he's been observing a famous day for his nation. Glyn, a tremendous amount of tension, not least because so little will be known tonight about the Assembly elections.
Well, indeed, it has been a momentous day, electing the first ever National Assembly. The count, as you said, doesn't happen until tomorrow morning. The counting you can hear going on behind me is for some local council elections. Our poll, our election night poll, shows that Labour is by no means absolutely certain of getting an overall majority in the Assembly. It shows them on a range of between 28 and 32 seats. They need 31 to get that overall majority. Touch and go. It looks as if Plaid Cymru have put up a very good performance. Not enough perhaps to stop Labour getting an overall majority, but very nearly. It's going to be a knife-edge day tomorrow as that counting takes place.
Glenn, thank you very much. Well, we don't have any results from Wales, but we have some news from the local elections in England. Huw Edwards has been watching them from Millbank. Huw.
Kirsty, thanks a lot. There are 10,000 English council seats up for grabs tonight. The last time this happened 4 years ago, it did mark a very low point for John Major and the Tories and a very high point for Labour. So far tonight, Kirsty, very early days, I should say that, but we understand the turnout in these council elections in England is exceptionally low. It may be as low as 26%. That would be unprecedented, certainly, in recent decades, so that's something we're keeping our eyes on. There will be hundreds of Tory gains, certainly, maybe 1,000 or more, but whether that's enough to secure William Hague and to make him feel a little better about things is quite another matter. Another thing we're keeping our eyes on. Now, we'll be in touch with developments up and down the country. We think there's a big result due very soon in Sheffield, where the Lib Dems are hoping to inflict a big blow on the Labour council there. Jane Corbyn is in Sheffield. Jane, what can you tell us?
Well, as you join us, Huw, it's just been confirmed. The Lib Dems have taken Sheffield. They have won the necessary 8 seats to take it from Labour, and Sheffield has always been known as a Labour bastion. Indeed, they've held it, with the exception of 1 year, since 1929. So it's a big night for the Lib Dems. They're already celebrating. Labour have conceded defeat. Sheffield is now Liberal Democrat.
Jane, thanks very much indeed. We'll also be keeping an eye on Peterborough over in East Anglia, where the Tories are hoping to wrest control there. At the moment, it's neck and neck between Tories and Labour. And in the West Midlands, we'll bring you the story from Bromsgrove. A Tory win here would certainly be a big boost for William Hague's party. And Kirsty, we'll also have the intriguing results of a poll on identity, how English the English now feel, how Scottish the Scots now feel, as the political landscape is changing so rapidly. That's coming up soon. Back to you.
Thanks, Huw. Well, part of the excitement in any election is Peter Snow and his box of visual tricks. And tonight, Peter has a lot of explaining to do. Throughout the night, he'll be joining us from his bunker to make sense of it all with the aid of his latest graphics. First, Peter, though, what about this poll?
Right, Kirsty. Well, we talked to 4,000 people in Scotland and 4,000 people in Wales. First, the Scottish people, and we talked to many of them, indeed, after they'd voted as well, to check up how they'd voted. And here's what we think happened in Scotland. Now, these are people's first votes, the votes for the constituency seats. 42% for Labour, 30% the SNP, equaling their best ever back in October 74. First vote there for the Conservatives, 13%, and the Liberal Democrats on 11%. Now, those could be a bit higher, a bit lower. The 3% possible error in a poll, so it could be a bit higher, a bit lower, but Labour clearly well ahead on that first vote. Now, the second vote, the vote for the top-up seats, that means that overall the share of the seats should roughly equal the share of party votes, proportional representation. Labour a bit down, the SNP a bit up, that could help them in parts of Scotland, and the other two parties roughly the same for both votes. Now then, let's have a look. There's Edinburgh Castle. Just down below that will be where the Scottish Parliament will sit for the first 2 years, but down below that, the bottom of the Royal Mile, a mile away, in front of Holyrood Palace, a great new building is now being constructed. The new Scottish Parliament, the Holyrood Parliament. We've got a glimpse of it. Our artists have been in there, looking at the plans, and they've got this picture of this massive chamber here. And now I'm going to fill it up with our projection of the members of the Scottish Parliament, starting with the likely largest party, Labour, under Donald Dewar. Now, we're giving a range here because, of course, the poll could be up or down a bit, as I said on those figures. 55 to 61 for Labour under Donald Dewar. 55 to 61 seats in this 129-member Parliament. The Liberal Democrats under Jim Wallace, 10 to 16 of them. And then next, the Conservatives under David McCletchie, the Conservative leader in Scotland, 11 to 17 of them. And finally, the Scottish National Party, almost certain to be the largest opposition party, the formal opposition party in the Scottish Parliament, between 41 and 47 under Alex Salmond. People have been saying if he got less than 40, he'd be in trouble. Well, he's looking like getting comfortably above 40 seats. Now, let's just take a global look at this new Scottish Parliament. With the winning post here in the middle, 65 you need for an overall majority. There it is. 129 members altogether. Labour with 55 to 61, short of the winning post, even at the top of that range. Would need the help of the Liberal Democrats on 10 to 16 there. Whatever the size of the Liberal Democrats and Labour on the basis of our poll, even at the bottom of the range, they should just about be through it, whether they're in formal or informal cooperation. So it does look like control for Labour provided there with the Liberal Democrats. Here you have the Tories with 11 to 17 and the Scottish National Party over here. Now, on to Wales. We talked to 4,000 people here as well, many of them after they'd voted. The first vote in Wales for Labour, 45%. Plaid Cymru's first vote for the constituency seats, 26%. Best ever for Plaid Cymru in any election, 9% better than in European election of 94. The first vote for the Conservatives down there at 14%, just ahead. Fight there for third and fourth place between Lib Dems and the Conservatives. Now the second top-up seats, here we go. Up goes that Labour bloc, a little short, 41%. Doing rather well here, Plaid Cymru in the top-up votes. Again, very useful in South Wales, where all those Labour seats are, the constituency seats. It'll pick them up a few extra top-up seats there. Here, the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, much the same there in that second vote. Now, the shape of the Welsh Assembly. Here we go across Cardiff Bay to this magnificent new building being erected now. Richard Rogers designed it, the design of the Millennium Dome, up the stairs, into the chamber. It won't be used for 2 years, but it's a sort of dream we'd like you to have a look at. This is our artist's impression of it. Here it is, a round chamber, 60 members, and the likely largest party is, again, going to be Labour. Watch them, the Tories, the Lib Dems and Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalists over here. Let's just take a bird's eye view of all that and see what it's all going to look like. Here we have the winning post this time at 31. 60 members, 31 would be a majority. Labour between 28 and 32. Again, we're giving you a range here because of the possible error in our poll. The Conservatives on 7 to 11, the Liberal Democrats on 4 to 8, and Plaid Cymru over here on 13 to 17. Now look at the winning post. Labour could at the top of the range of our poll be through the winning post, at the bottom of the range of our poll could be short of it. So we're in for a very exciting night indeed, Kirsty.
It seems that you seem to be particularly excited by this voting system. Does it make it completely different for you?
Oh, well, indeed it does. It's quite complicated. I think when you understand the voting system, it actually makes a lot of sense. What it's essentially doing is saying, let's have lots of constituencies, representation, just like in a normal general election where people actually have MPs they can identify with in a constituency, plus this idea of a regional top-up, which means that the share of the seats for each party will, in the end, when you add the two types of seat together, roughly equal their share of the vote. Many people say it's fairer.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, I'm sure Roy Jenkins is watching. Well, political reaction to that poll in a moment, but first we've got outside broadcasts across the length and breadth of Scotland tonight, covering more than 30 declarations. Anne Mackenzie's at the Glasgow count. Scottish Secretary Donald Dewar is expected there any moment. Govan, again, one of the most fiercely fought contests. Ian McWhirter is in Edinburgh, where we'll find out if Scottish Tory leader David McCletchie can win the Edinburgh Pentland seat. If he doesn't, he gets a second chance because he's top of the list in Lothians. We're also in Falkirk West. That's where the Westminster MP Dennis Canavan failed to be selected by the Scottish Labour Party to fight this seat. He's now standing against the new Labour candidate. How will he win his way to Holywood, if indeed he does? And we'll be hearing how the Scottish Parliament is viewed from the Orkney Islands. We'll be asking people there if Holyrood rather than Westminster makes any difference to them. Jane Franchi's in Macduff. She'll be keeping an eye on the SNP leader Alex Salmon's reaction as the votes stack up. And from Inverness, the capital of the Highlands, we'll be hearing if a new political party, the Highlands, will make their way into the Scottish Parliament. Well, over the next 7 hours, we'll be joined by many leading politicians here in the studio. Let's get a brief reaction from our first panel to predictions in that poll. I'm joined now by Charlie Kennedy, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, Ian Blackford, and Douglas Alexander. Douglas Alexander, if this poll and the range of this poll is anywhere near correct, then the people of Scotland don't want you to be in charge.
Kirsty,
on your own.
It's much too early to make that kind of prediction. I mean, the votes that really matter are actually... What it would suggest, if it was replicated right across Scotland, is not just that Labour would be the largest party, but also that separation, the policy of the Scottish Party, has been decisively rejected. and the Liberal Democrats indeed putting in a very poor performance, coming behind even the discredited Conservatives.
Well, I mean, the SNP, I mean, presumably, if you hadn't called Kosovo unpardonable folly and if you hadn't put a penny in tax, you think you'd be doing better tonight?
No, I think we've had a super result. I mean, if this,
well, this isn't a result. Let's just say this is purely a survey of opinion.
If the exit poll was anywhere near correct, then we'll have had a super result tonight. But your poll indicates that we could have put 50% on the results from the last time round. This is a stepping stone to independence. The Scottish people have a renewed feeling of self-confidence that they've shown through the referendum. They're shown tonight. We'll build on that and continue to take Scotland forward towards independence.
Now, before I speak to the rest of the panel, we're about to find out when we're about to get that famous first result here in Scotland. We've sent our Moscow correspondent Alan Little into deepest, darkest Lanarkshire. He's at the Hamilton South Count. Alan, is this the place they want to make history?
They do. They want to be the constituency that elects the first Scottish member of Parliament, the first member of a Scottish Parliament for 300 years. And they've got a very well-oiled machine below me. This is the hall that made history in 1967 when Winnie Ewing was propelled into Parliament by a landslide and at that time, very surprising and shocking victory for the SNP. That's in a sense where it all started, and there's a great sense in this hall tonight of history coming full circle. They've got 167 workers beneath me. They're expecting the declaration very soon, and they're determined that they're going to be the first constituency to declare tonight.
How soon do you think? Any ideas?
It could be minutes away. We could have it certainly in the next 20 minutes or so, barring last-minute hitches.
That's fantastic. See what direct Labour does when you get them into a counting booth. Malcolm Rifkind, perhaps what Ian Blackford was saying was right then, that if the SNP vote is at this level, back where they were in October 1974, then it could be a stepping stone to independence and the ball has started to roll.
Well, what happened in 1974 is they got 30% of the vote, what your poll's predicting they get now. 5 years later, they lost all their seats. And therefore, that also could happen again.
But as far as the Conservatives are concerned, of course, you'll be looking no gift horses in the mouth, whether they come from regional lists or otherwise, because proportional representation has put you back on the map.
Well, we've always recognised that our recovery in Scotland will not be dramatic, it will not be overnight. It has to be a slow, steady recovery. If your poll is correct, if we have 17 seats in the Scottish Parliament, well, we have 0 at the moment. 17 on 0 is a pretty good bit of progress for one night's work.
Well, I'm going to ask you, Charlie Kennedy, about Sheffield in a moment. But first of all, I mean, on this poll prediction in Scotland, it doesn't look like you've done particularly well, and that you may be fighting to make any particular demands in a coalition government with Labour.
Well, I don't think we should get over-obsessed with coalition, because there's a number of outcomes here on the arithmetic. There may be a coalition, there could be a minority administration. We've made clear throughout the campaign that might well be a plausible outcome and not an unhealthy one from the point of view of democracy. If you've got a government with no overall majority, perhaps even Dennis Canavan holding the balance of power all on his own, heaven forbid, that would be an entertaining thought. They would actually have to work with the grain of the Parliament on issues like tuition fees.
Well, let's go back to our first past the post and look at the English result and look at that result first of all in Sheffield.
Sheffield, very good indeed, and we've also are taking control of Stockport, so that's a further step forward, and I think that will increase our comparative standing in Liverpool. So this is us emerging in the English elections as being a very credible opposition to the government of the day.
Turnout's looking extremely low, but we look as if we may actually get a declaration from Hamilton in as little as 2.5 minutes' time. But first, let's go straight over to Labour's campaign headquarters, Delta House in Glasgow, where David Porter is waiting to speak to us. David.
Kirsty, very good evening from Delta House, as you say, the headquarters of Labour here. And as you were saying, there is quite a bit of excitement building here now that the thought that first declaration might be quite soon. The office behind me is part of the area where Labour's campaign has been coordinated for the past month, and we will know within the next few hours whether in fact the campaign from Labour's point of view has been a success or not. They've very much been campaigning on one theme, the theme of trust. They say that Labour was the party that brought devolution to Scotland, so the people of Scotland should now trust Labour to run the new Parliament and the new government. A little bit later on this evening we'll be expecting a visit from the Scottish Secretary, Donald Dewar. That will be in the early hours of the morning. Who knows, by then he may be the First Minister-elect. But one thing is certainly sure here, that we're in for quite a long night, but I think a pretty exciting one here as well.
I think he'd be delighted if he was the First Minister-elect by the early hours of the morning, but you never know. John Pienaar's at the Scottish National Campaign headquarters in Edinburgh. John, are they looking at that poll with some interest?
They've been watching the poll with a great deal of interest. I think the party workers, you can see some of them behind me, joining some of the journalists who've been following the campaign, are crossing everything and hoping that they might squeeze an extra percent or two here and there.
Right now, we think we're going to get a declaration at Hamilton. John, if you just hang on, please, we're going straight over to Hamilton.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. here is the result of the Hamilton South parliamentary constituency. The number of votes for each candidate are Adam Ardrey, Scottish National Party, SNP, 6,922. Tom McCabe, Scottish Labour Party candidate, 14,098. Margaret Mitchell, the Scottish Conservative and Unionist candidate, 2,918. John Oswald, Scottish Liberal Democrats, 1,982. There were 88 spoiled papers, and with a majority of 7,176, I declare that Tom McCabe is elected.
There we have it there. We can see that Tom McCabe, the leader of South Lanarkshire Council, has made sure that the Hamilton count is the first count to return a member of the Scottish Parliament. Here is Tom McCabe.
Thanks very much, Alistair. Ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, I want to offer my very sincere thanks to the people of Hamilton who have turned out today and voted Labour. I firmly believe they've voted for the achievements of a Labour government, and they have voted for the vision of a Labour Party for our new Parliament in a better Scotland. I also want to say a very sincere thanks to all of those people who worked so hard during the past 4 or 5 weeks and in the time before that to achieve this historic victory. Could I say a very special thank you to my election agent, Brian Duffy. Our next victory will be tomorrow, when we begin the work of building a better Scotland. Whatever your politics, there is plenty to celebrate here tonight. We have a new Scotland, and we do have an opportunity to build a far better Scotland, one which is well placed to make its mark in the world and to bring Scotland forward as one of the leading democratic nations. This Parliament is the settled will of the Scottish people, and I think we all have an obligation to make it work. More importantly, I firmly believe that the parties who have contested this election have an obligation to ensure that they commit themselves to make this Parliament work for Scotland. Could I make a special mention of the other candidates who have contested this election with me? We hear a great deal about a new politics for Scotland.
First of all, the share of the vote. Labour took 54%, SNP 27%, Conservative 11%, and the Liberal Democrats on 8%. And let's look at the change now, the change from the 1997 general election. Labour is in fact down 11 percentage points. That is roughly in line with our poll. SNP is up 9 percentage points, Conservatives up 3, and the Liberal Democrats up 3. Before we go to the panel for reaction, Brian Taylor, what do you make of that first result?
I think the swing to the SNP is quite substantial. It has to be said that within our election night poll, there were indications that Labour might perhaps perform less well in its west of Scotland traditional heartland than perhaps it was in the rest of Scotland. So we should be cautious about reading too much into what I think is about a 10-point swing to the SNP in terms of the national picture, but nonetheless, a substantial swing their way. But of course, it has to be said, the outcome, the single outcome, is that the first member of the Scottish Parliament is a Labour member. And
he was determined to make history by being first, obviously.
As
leader of the council, and is in a position to affect that as well. David Denver, Professor of Politics at Lancaster University. What do you make of that result?
Well, I mean, one of the problems in generalising from a single result like this is that in Scotland the pattern of electoral competition varies so much from constituency to constituency. And it's also the case that in some parts of the country personality counts for quite a lot, in the Highlands and Islands, for example. So although there's lots of Labour SNP seats in the central belt, which this might go roughly like this, there are other places where it's SNP versus Conservative or Lib Dem versus Conservative, and you can't generalise from the Hamilton result to that kind of constituency.
But it will be interesting as the night progresses, looking at the cumulative votes from that whole area into the region, to see how people use particularly their second vote.
Oh yes, I mean this is one of the great unknowns of this election, is what will people do with the second vote. The indication from the poll was that Labour vote would be lower for the second regional vote, but it really is an unknown. This is where it's an exciting step into new territory for everybody.
Well, what do you make of that then, Douglas Alexander, your first member of the Scottish Parliament?
It's a very strong result. My strong congratulations to Tom McCabe. It was a tremendous victory for Labour. I think you've got to realise
Down
this
11
is just
percentage points.
well, this is just 2 years into the Westminster Parliament. It's virtually unprecedented for a government 2 years into a Westminster Parliament to be polling this level of success. So I think it's a good harbinger of things to come.
What do you think it makes for you, Ian Blackford, on the possibilities of a second vote?
Well, it's a super result, I have to say, for us. I think on the second vote we'll have to wait and see, but one thing is clear: if we have this swing throughout the west of Scotland, then we'll be taking seats from Labour tonight in Scotland.
Aha, you will you? Think you'll be taking Glasgow Govan?
Well, we'll wait to see, but certainly if that swing is repeated throughout the west of Scotland, there'll be 2 or 3 seats we'll be picking up from.
Well, there may only be one result from Hamilton South here in Scotland, but in England there have been a whole number of results. Huw Edwards, have they started to shape up any pattern, particularly for William Hague?
Well, Kirsty, it's a big night for lots of us, and it's certainly a big night for William Hague, because he really does need to make very big gains this evening in terms of council seats in England if he's to prove that he's getting the party back on track. As we know, 4 years ago the Tories had an absolutely disastrous night. They lost up to 2,000 councillors, so William Hague really has to at least gain 1,000, some say 1,200, some say 1,300 tonight if he's going to prove that he's back on the rails and that things are not quite as bad as they've been in the last 2 weeks, Kirsty, because he's had a pretty disastrous fortnight.
But an early blow for both Tony Blair and of course David Blunkett, losing Sheffield to the Liberal Democrats.
Oh, no doubt at all, and a very good win for the Liberal Democrats taking Sheffield, which has been such a Labour stronghold for so many years, so Lib Dems will be very, very pleased about that indeed. For Tony Blair, of course, it's a big night for him too, simply because we can at least say that it's a judgment on the New Labour project, if I can call it that, in so many areas which turned red 4 years ago, and whether those people locally like New Labour or not, perhaps we can judge on tonight's vote. The turnout, Kirsty, is very, very low, so that may undermine the judgment, maybe as low as 26%. Anyway, Kirsty, let me just update you on what we have so far. This is the scorecard, if I can call it that, so far this evening. Labour having lost control of 3 councils, Lib Dems having gained control of 1, we know that, it's Sheffield. Conservatives, no change so far, no overall control, up by 2, Independents still on 0. Let's move on to councillors, because what we can see there is that councillors are down by 51 for Labour, Lib Dems having gained a few councillors, some 9, the Tories having gained over 50. They need to gain many more than that in order to do well tonight. Others having lost 9, the Independents having lost 2. Moving on to some of the specific gains, Lib Dems having gained control of Sheffield, as we mentioned, and Stockport. Others on the list for us, Labour losses, Wyre Forest having been lost and Hindburn having been lost so far tonight by Labour. Labour having held Thurrock, Exeter, Portsmouth, Worcester and Sandwell, and they've also held on to Tameside, Wigan, Derby, Basildon and Stoke-on-Trent. As I was saying, it's a very, very big night for the Prime Minister, Mr Blair. It's a big test, as we were underlining, of New Labour's popularity in those council areas which turned red for the first time 4 years ago. As we were saying, for William Hague, a crumb of comfort that he can hardly do any worse than John Major did in '95, but he's got to show once again that his party is not quite as divided as some people are making out. And Paddy Ashdown, of course, his final set of local elections as leader, Lib Dems started the day as the second biggest party of local government, but they might end the day in 3rd place. We shall see. And to add to all that excitement, Peter Snow will be with us all night to give details of our survey of voters and to give us a hint of what we might be expecting. Over to you, Peter.
Well, Huw, we've now had a large number of these key wards. We've got 1,000 key wards, which give us a picture of the countrywide strength of the parties, how the parties are doing countrywide. 350 of them declared so far, 750,000 votes in England. And this gives us a first stab at the projected share of the vote all over the country. Of course, we will have, from Scotland and Wales, local elections building up over the next 24 hours, and that'll give us a really much more general picture of how it's all going. But at the moment, 35% it looks like for Labour, 33% for the Conservatives, just 2% behind Labour. Here in mid-term, they should be doing much better. 27% the Liberal Democrats, equal to their best ever in a local election projected share of the vote, and 5% the others. Now, the change that represents on the general election of 1997, hefty downswing for Labour. Up go the Tories by just 2% from an atrocious general election result, after all, 2 years ago, and the Liberal Democrats doing pretty well there, up 10%. Very low turnout, very unreliable, therefore, these essential. The message of this is just a broad message of this picture is to be treated with a grain of salt. Now, let's bring down our swingometer, and here we have the vulnerable Labour MPs here. Look how they go down to a swing to the Conservatives, and if there were a swing to Labour, then those blue Conservative MPs would turn from blue to red. Now, of course, for any point of swing, there's a different outcome in the House of Commons. Here we have at the moment the Labour majority of 179, a shocking great Labour majority. The Tories need no less, a blue swing here, no less than 7.5% to wipe out Labour's majority altogether. And to win an overall majority, they need a record-breaking swing of 11.5% for a Conservative majority of 1. Where are they now? Well, on the basis of that projected share of the vote, they would be down here, the Tories, down below, Labour majority of 1 there, down to 5.5%. We'll see Labour back with a pretty comfortable majority as a general election. And don't forget, this is a mid-term when the opposition should be doing very well, steaming ahead so that they no doubt will lose some momentum towards the election. It's going to be very, very difficult for the Tories to win the next general election. Now we're going to have a look just at the benchmarks here, just to give you a guide to what to watch for in the British Council elections. As Huw was saying earlier, if Labour go down below 1,000, then they're not doing terribly well compared to where they're doing nationally at the moment. So the Labour Party looking for 1,000 losses overall minimum. If they get worse than that, it's not too good. If they get better than that, in other words, they lose fewer than that, it's not too bad for Labour. The Tories, watch for 1,000 gains. If they gain about that number, then they're roughly where we expect them to be. Still not doing very well, but roughly where we expect them to be. If they do better than that, the Tories are doing better than expected. If they do worse than that and only make about 500 gains or no gains at all, well, of course they are making gains. We've seen them making a few. They're going to make quite a lot of gains, a few hundred perhaps. If they make 1,000, they're doing all right. Then we have here the Liberal Democrats. Expect them to lose about 200 seats altogether. If they're doing better than that, and they certainly are showing signs of doing very well, if they're doing better than that, then it certainly is a bit of a triumph for the Liberal Democrats.
Peter, thanks very much indeed. So several good stories unfolding. We will be hopping across the country to have a taste of what's going on. Let me just tell you before we do that the Tories have made one gain so far. It's good news for them. Craven in North Yorkshire on a fairly decent swing of 7%. And Labour have gained Walsall from no overall control, which is a good result. Rather less good news for the Lib Dems who've lost control of Eastbourne. We'll touch on all those very soon. Let's go over to Bromsgrove. Rita Chakrabarti is there. Rita, what's the story in Bromsgrove tonight?
Well, it looks like being a very good night for the Conservatives. The council, which has been Labour-led since 1995, has just gone to no overall control since the Conservatives have taken 9 seats from Labour. They're looking to retake control of this council, and it does look as if it's going that way. Certainly there's a mood of tremendous confidence amongst the Conservatives. The Tory MP for Bromsgrove, Julie Kirkbride, was seen earlier jumping around jubilantly, really very happy, expressing a lot of confidence. It must be said that this is the traditional Tory heartland. The district council here was Conservative really for as far back as anyone could remember, until 1995, the year of the Tory meltdown, when of course it went Labour. I think the story tonight might be if they retake the council, which it looks as if they're going to, by what margin they do. In 1997, the Tory vote did build from 1995, and a Tory MP, Julie Kirkbride, was returned to Westminster. They'll be looking to build on the sort of support she had then, so I think that will be the story.
So if people are asking the simple question, Rita, why has Labour suffered there? Is it because it's just a traditional Tory area and they're reverting to type, or is it because the Labour Council's been very unpopular?
I think it's rather difficult to tell. It was certainly the case that the turnout, as we know, appears to have been low across the country, so it may be that Labour has suffered from the politics of contentment, as Margaret Beckett put it yesterday. There certainly have been 1 or 2 issues locally where Labour might have suffered, in that there's been a controversial plan to set up a recreation ground that the Tories have vehemently opposed, and it may be that Labour has lost a few votes over that. One point that I didn't mention earlier is that the Labour leader, Trevor Porter, has actually lost his seat. So it may be an indication of discontent with Labour. It's a little difficult to say at the moment.
Rita, thanks very much indeed. We'll keep in touch. Let's go over to Brighton. Diana Medill is there. Diana, what's the story in Brighton?
Well, this is where the Tories are trying to make some sort of comeback. It is an area that used to be true blue Tory, but it's since become the jewel of the South as regards New Labour. They've got the 3 MPs of the area. They've also got a majority of 26 in the council up to tonight. The Tories are trying to make a bit of a comeback. It's a bit early to say whether they've managed to so far, because there are 2 votes going on in Brighton. One concerns the site of the new football ground, and so they've been sorting out the papers as regards that, and also then there is the vote as regards the council. The Greens are hoping to make a bit of an impact here too, because there are a couple of planning stories which are going on, and they have certainly been making their mark during the campaigning. The Liberal Democrats don't seem to count in Brighton and Hove. This is very much a Tory-Labour race. And we'll bring you the results as soon as they come in.
Just very quickly, Dan, it may be an unfair question to ask at this early stage, but we're looking at very low turnouts throughout these council elections, but because of that local factor you mentioned there, a bit of an innovative thing, if you like, in local elections, does that seem to have brought more people out to vote, do you think?
No, I don't think so. People here are talking about a low turnout as well, and I don't think it'll be too long before some sort of results begin to come through. It's just simply the sorting of paper that seems to be taking the time more than anything else.
Diana, thanks very much indeed. Let's go up to Sheffield, scene of that famous victory by the Lib Dems there, who've ousted Labour after so many years. Jane Corbyn is there. It is in Sheffield.
Well, the Liberal Democrats are celebrating, as you say. They've taken Sheffield. It's been Labour for a good many decades, and there's a lot of jubilation here tonight, and Labour are obviously now trying to figure out what went wrong. I think one of the real problems here in Sheffield is that this is a city that had a fading industry, steel. When it went into decline, they borrowed heavily. They set up grandiose schemes here, swimming pools, leisure centres, a super tram system that became a bit of a white elephant, and they saddled people here with enormous debt. I mean, council tax is running at around £886 per head, and £80 of that was sheer debt to service those kind of schemes that Sheffield had invested in the past. The Liberal Democrats made a lot of that in their campaign, and it seems tonight that they've taken control, and they are promising as a very first effort to get to grips with what they've called the sorry financial legacy of what Labour has left behind.
Has it been an unpleasant fight at all, Jane? Has it been very, it seems like a hard-fought contest, obviously, but has it been less than pleasant at times?
It's certainly been hard fought. It's not been a situation, as we've seen in other parts of the country, where Labour and Liberal have worked together, and in fact Liberals haven't fielded candidates, a sort of tacit pact, as it were. It's not been the case here. It's been hard won, and it's been pretty hotly contested.
Jane Corbyn, thanks very much indeed. Well, we will be, of course, keeping you up to date with what's happening in Scotland, that historic election which is going on at the moment, those results coming in. You'll be able to catch up with the results in your own region, across England, by the way, at 20 to midnight, and again at about 20 past midnight. And throughout the night, the latest details will, of course, be available on CFAX on page 700 and on the World Wide Web. The address for you for BBC Online is www.bbc.co.uk/vote99. I hope you've got that. So that's the online address. Now, we're in very good company here in the studio, I'm pleased to say. Our expert guides are with us, Professor Anthony King of Essex University and Alison Park from the Centre for Research into Electoral and Social Trends. She's our polling analyst. Welcome to you both, and thank you both for coming in. We'll be teasing out some of the trends with you and getting the bigger picture. And if I may say so, trying to make the facts fit their own stories are the politicians. Perhaps that's a bit unfair to start off on. Margaret Beckett, Leader of the House of Commons, welcome. Michael Ancram, Conservative Chairman. And Simon Hughes, one of the big contenders for the Liberal Democrat leadership. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much indeed. Could I start with you, Alison, and then go on to Tony? If the turnout, Alison, is as low as 26%, and I stress we don't have a formal figure, if it is as low as that, where does that rank in terms of the years that we know we've got records for, and what does that mean if it is that low?
Well, I think the important thing to bear in mind, turnout in elections is always much, much lower than turnout in general elections, and the average over the last 20 or 30 between 35 and 45%. So if current predictions are right and it's in the region of 26%, that's very, very low indeed. And it's lower than last year, which was 29%, and that was considered quite extraordinary.
So, in memory, it's not been as low as 26%?
No, certainly not.
I mean, why would that be? Why would that be the case? Is it because people just don't rate local elections as being important enough to bother about?
Well, I think it's important to remember that obviously within different local areas, turnout will vary, and I'm sure we'll see tonight particular instances when there's high competition between two parties, when campaigning has been particularly intense. And then I think turnout will be much higher, but in areas perhaps where there isn't so much competition, there might well be far greater cases of apathy amongst the voters.
Tony, are you surprised if that figure's right, 26%? Would you be surprised by that?
No, I'm not entirely surprised. People are going to turn out in elections if they think there's something big to be decided, or they wish to register an enormous protest against something or somebody. I don't think most people think in these local elections in England today, as distinct from in Scotland and Wales, that anything important is at stake, and most people appear, as Margaret has kept telling us, reasonably contented with the government. Why should they bother to turn out? Where you get high turnout in local elections is where people feel passionately that they want to go to the polls and register their objections to something that's going on.
So if somebody asked the rude question, Tony, at this early stage, look, you know, there's a turnout this low, frankly, why on earth should we bother making any kind of projections from this kind of result? And does that not tell us nothing at all about, you know, a national picture, if I put it?
I don't think question at all. I think that's a perfectly reasonable question under the circumstances. I mean, the gap between what the national are about how people say they would vote in a general election and what we're getting in these local elections is simply enormous. Not only that, but we're getting very divergent results from different places, possibly partly as the result of the low turnout. It looks as though these are probably the most local elections we've ever seen. We see the Liberal Democrats losing to no overall control in Eastbourne, while gaining Stockport, while Sheffield. And so far is significant in not being a pattern. I think this is the most extraordinary collection of local election results I have ever seen.
We'll develop some of these themes, I promise you, and before I go to the politicians, I want us to have a quick word with Robin Oakley, our political editor, who's keeping us in touch with the main party HQs, I beg your pardon, the main party headquarters. He's at central office now. Robin, good evening to you.
Good evening, Huw.
Now, if we look at this very low turnout, however, we're looking probably at quite a few Conservative gains. What can you tell us about the expectations there at central office?
Well, the Conservatives entered this evening with some apprehension, aware that usually it's governments of the day which are on trial in mid-term, and knowing that this time round they were on trial and that there were question marks about William Hague's leadership if they didn't produce a good enough showing tonight. Well, I can say that the mood here has lightened considerably since I arrived half an hour ago. They are already claiming to have taken control of Craven in Yorkshire, of Worthing on the south coast, of South Hams in the West Country, and they are certainly feeling that they are now on target to kind of level of overall seat gains, somewhere around 1,200 seat gains overall nationally, to take the heat off William Hague, as one party worker was putting it to me.
Interesting, Robin, and it's an interesting list, and I'm just looking there at the results coming in. Bromsgrove, which is a pretty good target for the Tories. They've apparently taken that from Labour, so that's another thing for them to be happy about. You mentioned the figure of 1,200 gains. Are they therefore accepting that as a kind of decent benchmark at central office, and are they saying even at this early stage, even now, the spinning has already started to the effect that Mr Hague is safe?
Well, yes, we're certainly getting comments of that kind, nothing officially up front as yet, but that is the feeling, I think, among the workers here. They're very definitely heartened by the way things are going, and they're saying that they're starting to get a foothold back in the kind of areas where they weren't actually expecting to make particular gains tonight. And what's so crucial to them, this is a party which had, when the Tories came to power nationally in 1979, they had 12,000 councillors nationally. They're down to about 4,500 now. If they can get back an extra 1,000 councillors, that enormously increases their impetus and their workforce in local government. And William Hague has said their route back to national recovery is through local government initially. So they will take great encouragement from any figure above 1,000, really, although most commentators will point out that, of course, they lost 2,000 seats when these seats were last contested in 1995, and that would only really put them back on level pegging. But the other great measurement that they're paying attention to is the national share of the vote that comes out of these elections. What Mr Hague has got to do is to produce something better than the 31% the Tories had at the last general election. because as the national opinion polls are standing at the moment, if the Tories scored at the next general election on those lines, they'd lose another 60 of the 164 MPs they've been reduced to.
OK, Robin, we'll talk to you a little later from the other HQs. For a moment, thank you very much indeed. A quick comment at this stage, because we've got lots to talk about, and I just want some headlines from you, if I can. Margaret Beckett, first of all. What are you looking for, and are you encouraged by what you've seen so far?
Yes, I am. There are two things that particularly encourage me. One of them is that you say the Tories have taken Bromsgrove, which is one of the 30 councils that they lost for the first time in '95. They should be taking back. They have not taken back Broxtowe in the East Midlands, which is equally one of the 30 councils took for the first time ever in '95, and they should be looking to take back. But the other thing that is coming through your statistics so far, and that I think is so unbelievable I hardly dare to mention it, is that according to your percentage, your overall share of the vote, we are slightly ahead of the Conservatives in overall share of the vote. If that is the outcome at the end of tonight, that would be the first time this century that any government has actually been ahead of the opposition in mid-term elections. I mean, I'm almost frightened to mention it because it would be such an incredible outcome.
You'd be brave. OK, Margaret. Michael.
Margaret's fear is touching.
It is certainly. It certainly is. No, but at least from your point of view, Michael, we have a figure from Central Office which is now 1,200 seats, a minimum gain of 1,200 seats for you, and at least we know where you're coming from.
Well, I don't think we're in a position yet to make predictions. What I said earlier was that we wanted to win as many seats as we could. What we're seeing now is a pattern emerging. We're winning in a whole lot of different areas. We won Craven from no overall control. We won Bromsgrove from Labour. We won Worthing from the Liberals. We hope to win South Hams. We've knocked the Liberals out in Eastbourne. We are making progress. We beat the Labour leader of Sunderland Council, perhaps a rather remarkable achievement. We are winning all over the country, and this is what we set out to do with our candidates who worked immensely hard, and I'm delighted we're beginning to see that pattern. May I say, Margaret may be pleased about being 2 points ahead. I'm delighted if they're only 2 points ahead compared to the lead they've had in the opinion poll for some time.
Okay. A quick comment, Simon. Pretty good news from Sheffield, but bad news further south.
Two headlines. One is the share of the vote for us is clearly going up. It's gone up since last year by about 4%, up since the general election about 10%. And the other two parties are not in the same league as that, so that's good news. In terms of results, Liverpool last year, Labour forever, Sheffield this year, and Stockport as well, and some other places in the north with gains. Yes, we may have lost a few seats to the Tories in the south, but it was against the worst ever Tory performance in history.
Well, we'll let you say more about that. We're going to pause for a moment because viewers in England now have some more detailed results in their own areas. Viewers in Wales and Northern Ireland, stay with us. We'll be back together in a few minutes' time for the latest picture. See you then. Now then, I'm glad to say that viewers in Wales and Northern Ireland are still with us. Simon, you were saying there about the mixed picture. Is it one that Paddy Ashton can be proud of at the end of his stewardship?
Yes, he certainly can. And picking up a comment that Robin made from Tory party headquarters, when Mrs Thatcher came to power, we had one council which we ran. We now were defending 40 tonight. The Tories in that year had 250. This year they have 25. So there's been a transformation, and the reality is that over the time Paddy's been leader, 11 years this year, the Tories have become the third party of local government. They just crept back in the last year or so in terms of numbers of councillors ahead of us, so they're ahead of us on councillors tonight, although they're behind on councils. But no, we have now become recognised in places like, we're winning seats now in Bradford, we're winning seats in Leicester, places that were no-go areas for us 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Margaret?
Well, Simon's talking a very good game, but for a start, that comparison he just made with the general election result is, I'm sure he's perfectly well aware, totally invalid. If you compare it with the last time, if you compare your share of the vote with what you had in 1995, it was 24 and now it's 27, and last year it was 26. So it's actually quite a marginal shift in terms of comparing like with like.
Each of them are up. You must concede they're all going up, though.
And secondly, where you have held councils in places like Eastbourne and Worthing and elsewhere, and Taunton Dean, actually you're losing them. You're taking councils where people haven't had any experience of Liberals in government and local councils.
Michael?
Yes, I'm looking at the figures. I mean, if the 33% share of the poll is right, and Margaret was saying how excited she was only to be 2 points ahead of us, that is actually the highest share of a poll that we have got for the last 7 years. And that is a significant advance for us. I think what is important
is... You got 32 last year.
Yeah, well, this is 33 we're talking about at the moment. It is actually, in terms, it is actually the highest.
It's my turn to be the killjoy and say, let's be very careful about these figures at this stage.
It's moving... I mean,
it's not a big leap forward, Michael, but it's a bit of a creeping forward.
Compared to where we were 4 years ago, it is a significant advance, and I think we will see the sort of results which we're hoping to see.
Okay. Would you be disappointed if if Labour had held Trafford?
I haven't. Trafford, I don't think is one of our particular targets.
Just as well, because I think they have.
We only won it in 97.
Okay, well look, as I said, viewers in Wales and Northern Ireland are with us, and I want to go straight to Cardiff, where Gito Harry awaits us with a pretty high-profile guest. Gito, over to you.
Yes, it's very exciting here, Huw, because there is some doubt, only a little doubt perhaps, but some doubt as to whether or not Labour can actually manage to govern the National Assembly with a majority. The figures are quite vague, but I've got someone with me who's more qualified than most to interpret them. The former Welsh Secretary, Ron Davies, a candidate in this election. Thanks for joining us. What do you make of this prediction? The poll suggesting you could be short of that necessary majority.
Yes, but these polls are based on exit poll, and they're based on projections which assume that everybody in Wales is voting in the same way, and I don't think that's going to happen. I believe that Labour will have at least 34 seats, and that will be a comfortable majority, and I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that.
But in terms of the percentage of the vote, it's clear you've lost ground since the general election. What do you think is to blame for that?
I think two things have happened. First of all, the turnout undoubtedly is down, and it may be that we don't reach 50%, and that'll be a disappointment. But secondly, of course, the pattern right across Europe is when you have parliaments, regional assemblies being elected, people do tend to give greater priority to regional parties. And I think that's what's happened in the case of Plaid Cymru. They've obviously done relatively well, and probably at the expense of all three other parties.
You say relatively well. Plaid Cymru got less than 10% of the vote at the general election. They've come from 4th place to seriously challenging you across Wales. No. They've broken out of their heartlands.
No, they're not seriously challenging. We don't know yet whether they've won one additional seat. And it's relatively easy to get a higher percentage when your own people are turning out and the overall turnout is down, and I think that's what's happened. But I mean, credit to Plaid Cymru, let's recognise the fact that they have done reasonably well, and by comparison with other parties, they're probably the winners of the night.
You are known in Wales and beyond as the architect of inclusive politics. You wanted parties to work together. This result might actually play into your hands. Has to work with others.
No, consensus politics, working together, inclusiveness is not just about stitching together coalitions if the elections don't produce a clear majority. It's about recognising that you actually have to include all parts of the country in the government that you have, and that you have to sometimes recognise merit in the positions of other parties, at least part of them, and that's what we're going to do now.
Ron Davies, we must leave it there. That's all from Cardiff, but we'll be joining you again later on.
Gito, thanks very much indeed. It's very kind of you, and Ron Davies obviously feeling pretty confident there. We're now going to be joined again by viewers across England who are going to get a pretty big update on what's going on. And welcome back to all of you. Now then, let me update you on the latest scorecard and the state of affairs here in these council elections. Labour having lost control of 3 councils, the Conservatives having gained control of 3, the Lib Dems on 0 in terms of change at the moment. No overall control, that's that mysterious NOC, no overall control, no change there. Now then, in terms of councillors, Labour having lost nearly 150, the Conservatives having gained nearly 150 councillors, the Lib Dems having gained a modest 13 at this stage, others down 18, independents plus 8. Now, in terms of gains, in terms of councils themselves, Bromsgrove, Craven, Malden are some of the more recent Conservative gains. Lib Dem gains being Sheffield and Stockport. We talked about Sheffield earlier on. Other Lib Dem losses, Eastbourne, quite a big loss for them, Taunton, Dean as well. Let's go straight up to Anne Mackenzie, who's in Glasgow, and Anne can give us a quick update on the mood up in Scotland. Anne, over to you.
Well, Huw, we've had so far just one result in these elections. Hamilton, as you may have seen, is pretty much in line with the BBC voters poll. The SNP appear to be up about 8 points, but Labour still held on to the seat. And of course, as you already know from that poll, it would suggest that Labour are in line for either a minority government if they get the upper end of the seats that's been suggested, or perhaps a coalition, most probably with the Liberal Democrats. One interesting point so far is though that first indications, when I stress they are first indications, are that the turnout for this first Parliament for Scotland for 300 years are actually quite low. You see Glasgow Govan, which is one of the marginal seats counting behind me, the turnout we're suggesting 45%, which is extremely low.
Well, indeed, and any ideas as to why that might be, Anne? After all, lots of the commentators have been assuming that because of the significant nature of this election, that lots of Scottish voters, maybe not so many Welsh voters, but lots of Scottish voters would be turning out enthusiastically. Why might it not be the case in that area?
Well, indeed, one can only speculate. A lot of people have been describing this campaign as boring. I would hesitate to add my voice to these, but it has perhaps not exactly taken off. There's been no big defining moment to galvanise it, no Jennifer's ear, as it were. There's also, of course, the complications of the voting system. As you know, voters here have been faced with 3 differently coloured papers, one of them extremely long. I believe one in Lothian was the longest, physically the longest election paper in British voting history. Perhaps that might have put people off a bit.
Well, we'll talk about that later. Anne, thanks very much indeed. Let's update ourselves as to the position down in Somerset and Sedgemoor Council. Dinah Lammerman is there. Dinah, what can you tell us?
Well, the situation down in Sedgemoor is that the Tories needed to gain another 4 seats on top of what they got in 1995 in order to take back control of the council, which of course they did control for 20 years up until 1995. They've won 3 of those seats, and there is now a recount going on in one of the vital wards. I'm joined by Tom King, who's the local MP for this area. What do you feel so far about what we've been seeing?
Well, I think we've been going in the right direction. The Liberal Democrats are getting squeezed here. They've lost seats to Labour as well, and I hope we end up with control. I can't be sure, but certainly we're going in the right direction, and if we keep our fingers crossed, fair win, we might just get there.
It's a slightly different picture here for the Liberal Democrats than it is nationally. Why do you think that is?
I think that people are fed up with they've had Liberal Democrats in control in Somerset County Council for too long. They're fed up with the waste and the way in which they conduct their activities, and I think they're going to pay the price for it.
Now, the Tories at this point in the Parliament really need to be gaining support, taking support from Labour, and that's not actually happening across the country. Do you think that's any reflection on William Hague's leadership?
Well, the government's in a strong position at the moment. It's still early days in the sense for the government, but I think that they've got some very difficult problems at the moment, and there is undoubtedly, as I went around campaigning, disillusion with the fact that the promises and the pledges that the government made and this famous card that everybody got aren't being honoured.
So do you think there might be questions asked about his leadership after this night?
What, for the Conservatives? No, not at all. I think that this is, so far as I see it in this part of the world, an encouraging evening, and we're going in the right direction.
Thank you for that. For that last result, well, for that vital result, and a few more awards to come in here in Sedgemoor.
Dinah, we'll be back for that. Thanks very much indeed. Intriguing there, Tony, listening to Anne Mackenzie before Dinah was up there talking to us from Glasgow about the ballot papers and the fact that, you know, they must be quite off-putting, some of these ballot papers, if they're as long as they're physically as long as Anne was suggesting.
And in Scotland, 3 different colours.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, what kind of impact, how does this impact on the process?
I think there's a much more general point to be made about all this. One of the things that the present government has set itself to do is to get people to participate more and more in politics. And one of the ways in which it's setting about doing that is to have more and more elections. In Scotland, in Wales, in addition to the usual local elections, we're having the Euros coming up. There's talk of widespread referendums in local authorities. We've just been talking about one in Brighton. If there's one thing we know from the experience of other countries, as well as I think from what we would expect by way of hunch, it's that the more elections you have, the more you ask people to turn out to vote, the more disinclined they are to do precisely that. And we've seen, I think, a good example of that tonight. I think we're going to see it again in June in connection with the Euro elections, in which case, as Alison was saying earlier on, the turnout tends to be even lower than in locals.
Well, in terms of turnout, Alison, again, an intriguing message there from that Hamilton result. The turnout was relatively low, certainly in comparison to the general election. Again, given the prominence that this election campaign has been given, it may have been boring, as I was saying, but it's certainly been prominent. Why, again, are we looking at a turnout which is lower than we expected?
Well, yes, I mean, you're right that it's a very, very unexpectedly low turnout. I think that one of the key things that people need to bear in mind is that it does make one worry quite considerably what will happen in Wales, where enthusiasm for the Welsh Assembly was far less pronounced than was the case in Scotland. From what's happened in Hamilton South, it seems that the turnout will be between 55 and 60% throughout Scotland as a whole, which is indeed rather lower than turnout in the general election, which was in the low 70s.
I mean, when you say it's clearly significantly lower, would you class it as a very disappointing turnout given the prominence of the election, or is it just a little disappointing? I mean, what's the grade of it?
I think a lot of people would have expected the elections to the Scottish Parliament to have attained the same sort of turnout as a general election for the
so
UK
70%
Parliament.
Or,
That's right.
That's interesting. And Tony, just can I just ask you one question to do with those ballot papers, because lots of viewers in England clearly will not be familiar with the system that's being operated in Wales and Scotland. Welsh viewers will know about these two votes that they've been using today for the Welsh Assembly and a similar system for the Scottish Parliament. The first ballot paper being the system we all know and recognise, first past the post, you vote for one person. What happens on this second ballot paper?
Well, let me get rid of the third ballot paper, which is simply the local ballot paper, which is exactly the same kind that you'd be getting in England and Wales. Now, the second ballot simply invites every Scot or every Welsh person who lives in an electoral region, and everybody does live in one, to vote for the party of their choice. The polls indicate, and indeed the election night polls that we've been having from Scotland and Wales indicate, that most people who vote Conservative on the first ballot are also voting Conservative on the second ballot. But they don't have to do that. In the United States, they talk about split ticket voting, and it's perfectly open, for example, for a Conservative in Glasgow who thinks his local Tory candidate no chance of winning in the first past the post constituency, but who wants to see Conservatives return to the Scottish Parliament, to vote, say, for the SNP on the first ballot, and to go to his or her natural choice, the Conservative Party, on the second ballot. It's a new system, but it is one that has been used in an awful lot of countries. I think it'll probably take people 2 or 3 elections to figure out how to make it work.
Interesting. A final point, Alison.
It's worth bearing in mind that a similar system will be used, of course, for the European elections in a month's time, a system which is similar to the second part of the Scottish and Welsh vote.
It's rather dizzying, really, isn't it? But we'll find out how it works out. Thanks very much. I was mentioning to Kirsty earlier on when we spoke about one of the intriguing aspects of the survey that Peter Snow has for us, and that is to do with how Scottish the Scots feel now that they have their Parliament, or they're about to have it at least, and perhaps more importantly in this context, in the context of this programme, how English people feel, or how British they might feel. All those details, and it is quite interesting now with Peter Snow.
A very interesting contrast we found between the way people felt about their identity in Scotland and in England. First of all, 4,000 people in Scotland. We asked them how they saw themselves. British, not Scottish, more British than Scottish. A total there of 10% said they felt British rather than Scottish. Only 5% said they felt more British than Scottish. 26%, a sizable number of people, felt equally British and Scottish. This is in Scotland. But when we asked them whether they felt more Scottish than British, or Scottish and not British at all, look, more than half of all the people felt that one of those two categories was how they felt. 56% altogether, most of them feeling more Scottish than British. Then we talked to people in England, and look what the difference is in the picture here. British, not English, or more British than English, 16% and 12%. 28% altogether then felt British rather than English, or more British than English. Equally British and English, a hefty 41%. So the largest chunk of the people we talked to in England felt equally British and English. More English than British, or English not British, where the Scottishness had come through so strongly in Scotland, only 15% and 9%. So a quite different and contrasting sense of identity between England and Scotland.